We run into this problem where people are trying to hit multiple objectives in building these evals. Like an issue is that when you build a new eval, you go and you build the eval, and it might turn out that you finish it, and then the LLM gets 99% on it. And suddenly you wasted all this time of building an eval. So when you build an eval now, you have to think carefully about making sure that LLMs can't answer it all correctly. It's kind of a mess. And I think we're just running out of steam here where people can actually write questions that frontier LLMs get wrong because they're not smart enough, because we're just scraping the boundary of knowledge. And so when we think about what are the right questions to work on now at Future House, we just say, hey, how many fundamental new discoveries can our systems make? And if that's the measure, if we do that every time we get a new discovery, we're advancing scientific knowledge and evaluating the systems at the same time. So that's where we want to be. But of course, we're not all the way there yet.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Farsight's Existential Hope podcast. I'm super happy to have Andrew White here. Andrew, you are the co-founder of Future House, have some other hats on as well, and are just like a really amazing thinker in the AI for science space. So I'm really excited to pick your brain. Perhaps let's kick it off with a bit on your background. Your bio mentions over 50 peer-reviewed publications and books in all kinds of different areas, covering LLMs, chemistry, explainable AI, statistical mechanics, chemical engineering, you name it, really. Like, how did all of these interests converge? How did they make sense to you? And how did they ultimately perhaps influence you to co-found Future House?
Yeah. All right. I'll start from the beginning. So when I started my PhD, I really wanted to do work with computers, and I was in chemical engineering, and I don't know, I was this person that wanted to do like a lot of things. And so I told one of my professors that I really like chemistry, physics, engineering, and programming, and I want to be able to do all of them. And he said, well, I guess chemical engineering is the only thing that kind of fits that. And so then when I went to do my PhD, I went into a lab that was basically done some work on a method called molecular dynamics. And molecular dynamics is like a really popular method in biology and physical chemistry that tries to simulate atoms as a single particle. Really cool method, and I'll talk more about it later. But anyway, I wanted to do that and in a lab that was doing experiments. And so I went to this lab that was working on biomaterials, and Xiaoyi Zhang was my PhD advisor, and we were trying to figure out how to model biomaterials that resist non-specific interactions. So these are things like you want to put an electrode in a brain, so like you want to build like a brain-machine interface. The problem is that the body sees that as a wound, and it tries to heal that wound by covering it up with something called a foreign body response. And so we were designing materials that could kind of block that to make the body feel like it's not some sort of foreign object or some wound to heal. And we were going to try to do that with molecular dynamics. And that sounds insane, and it still sounds insane. Like, it doesn't make any sense to try to simulate atoms and use that to design a biomaterial. So I started off my PhD, and the only thing we could come up with was looking at water, like the role of water in this, because we had this hypothesis that if, the amount of water that would be in these systems is similar to physiological, then maybe that would work well. Anyway, so we went down this path, and I did a lot of simulations of water, and then I did a lot of bioinformatics work, like seeing what are common patterns on surfaces in the human body or in cells. And I kept getting stuck by this problem that what would happen in the lab had nothing to do with what a molecular simulation would do. And so throughout my academic journey, I kept trying to find ways to bridge, first principle simulations like molecular dynamics with experimental results. And that was what my postdoc at UChicago was on. And then I formed my research lab at University of Rochester on trying to bridge the gap between simulation and experiments. And then in 2019, actually, I did a sabbatical at UCLA at something called the Institute for Pure and Applied Mathematics. And this IPAM is what it's called. They brought together, Jan LeCun was there and Frank Noe was there. We had this guy named Pat Riley who did a lot of Google science work when Google Accelerated Science was the thing. And all these people were at this long 3-month program working on how do we use machine learning in physical sciences. And so people were working on physics, people were working on material science, people were working on fluid mechanics. I was working chemical engineering, and some people working on drug discovery and protein structure. It was a really cool environment. And that gave me the time to pause and breathe. Being an assistant professor is a very time-consuming process. And being in UCLA, I lived in LA. I lived with my wife and my son there. And I was able to, sort of just take some time, absorb what's going on in the field. And I realized that machine learning really is a way to bridge any kind of computational modeling and experiments, right? So I wrote a textbook on this at the time. I don't know, I'm a very active learner. So rather than try to learn something by reading and stuff, I decided to write a book. It's probably not the best way, but it was a living book that I iterated over for a number of years. In fact, I was working on a new version of it a couple weeks ago. And then I went back and started teaching a class on it, started working on machine learning and chemistry. Anyway, it's a very long explanation of how I got to there, but that's sort of how I got to that point of being in the domain of machine learning and chemistry. And then I started working on language models because during the pandemic, everyone I know kind of went a little crazy. I was like starting to question whether or not, molecules can be represented as a collection of bonds and atoms. It's kind of a funny thing about chemistry is a chemical bond is like a platonic ideal. There's actually no definition of what a chemical bond is. So maybe start to question everything about chemistry. Again, remember, I'm like isolated in my house, nothing to do for months
What
at a
the
time.
pandemic makes you do.
Yes, exactly. And so I basically was like, how do we reframe chemistry? And what I came up with was using natural language because my idea was like the only thing that really happens in a lab is like the actions you take to make something. And the best way to represent actions you take in a lab is natural language. And so I had this hypothesis that natural language is the way to represent chemistry. And that was around the same time language models were becoming popular, which was really convenient because you could actually test some of these ideas. And that led to, I think, some really cool work that ended up with me working on GPT-4 with OpenAI on doing red teaming. But anyway, I do want to mention that IPAM at UCLA, really great program. It actually is, they're doing a program this fall on applying machine learning principles and simulation to electrochemistry. The program has been suspended because of the Trump administration withholding grants from UCLA. I personally donated money to IPAM, and I'm trying to work in the philanthropy space to see if anyone can help bridge that funding. But that was a really important program for my career, and it was very sad to see that it's now in danger right now.
Share a link and we'll add it to the show notes here, and then perhaps we can get a few more dollars dedicated to that. I mean, you've really, I guess, worn so many hats already at that point, and we're not even yet, I guess, at the Future House stage. So I think Future House to me is one of the more exciting projects in the Bay Area, and not only because your offices is possibly the coolest office that an organization has ever had in the Bay, but also because the people that are working there on the mission are just so, it could hardly be timelier and are like really dedicated on driving AI for science projects. So could you just, in a wrapper explain just what does Future House do actually? And what is all the bird language of crows, falcons, owls, and phoenixes? What about?
Yes. Okay. So Future House, the mission is build an AI scientist. I think our mission changes on my level of optimism of the week, but basically our mission is either build an AI scientist, automate scientific discovery, or accelerate scientific discovery. Those are the sort of the three tiers, So I think, I would say our mission is successful when we have, materially accelerated anyone's process of scientific discovery. And so we build tools to do that. Obviously we want to build an AI scientist, but we're trying to build it in phases. We're building what I would call like AI assistants, things that can automate literature search, things that can automate data analysis, things that can automate molecular design. But of course, scientific discovery is bigger than that. Future House is a nonprofit co-founded between me and Sam Rodriguez 2 years ago. Sam is the CEO. I'm head of science, which is this nebulous title that means I want to like do hands-on work, but then I also want to have some level of leadership in the org. And yeah, our mascot is crow. And this came out of a paper I wrote with a group at Rochester in Switzerland, and this was about automating process of molecular design called ChemCrow. And at the time, there was like this idea of a language model is like a stochastic parrot. It's just repeating stuff. And it turns out that crows also can just parrot back words. So crows can talk. So you can go look up videos on YouTube of crows talking. They can say, hello or nevermore or whatever. But they use tools, right? And so crows have language, like they can talk and they can like a language model, but they use tools. And so we've been building like these sort of agents that can speak in English and natural language, but also use tools. And they're maybe more intelligent than a parrot. Although, of course, after we did this, someone found a video on YouTube of a parrot using tools. And so then it kind of crashed my whole worldview. So I choose to ignore that fact. But so that was the kind of thing. And then, why do we have falcon and crow and owl as some of our agents? Is that basically we suck at naming things. And I don't know if anyone has ever learned how to name things correctly in AI. I don't know. You can look at the AI companies' naming of things and you can see that it's a very hard thing to do. And we wanted to come up with a way to separate like the models that are behind the things we build from like the product, or I shouldn't call it product, the agent that people use. So then based on the idea that crow was like our first thing, we started using bird names to be like how you interact with the system to separate from like paper QA. So crow also probably should have been called crow, but crow is like the literature search agent. And then paper QA is the algorithm behind it. Or like Phoenix is like our chemistry one and ChemCrow is like the thing behind it. Or we have a protein design one called Protein Crow, but we haven't given it like a bird name. I don't know what we called. I think Pateau is my current thesis. Some of you guys have seen a Pateau, but it's like a terrifying, crazy looking, funny, hilarious looking bird, which I feel like represents the process of protein design. So anyway, that was a whole bunch of information. That's kind of Future House there.
Yeah, could you provide a little bit more info on what do these various different birds do for someone who has not used any of them yet? I mean, if anyone hasn't used them yet, I would just go to the website and start playing around with a few. They're really quite phenomenal. But yeah, give us a little bit of a look under the hood. What are they useful for? What have they done? What have these birds achieved so far?
Yeah, one of the birds of cheese. Yes. So yeah, Future House, 30 people and 25, 30 people right now. And we're building these agents, which are basically a collection of tools in an environment. And they're focused around some kind of problem type. And so Crow will do literature search. So you can ask it something like, make a list of all of the molecular degrader drugs that have been, reported in literature. It'll go through and read papers, see who cited this paper. Is it from a predatory journal or not? They'll do Google Scholar searches just like you would do. They'll read through papers page by page, build up a dossier of evidence of how it can answer the question. They'll try to propose an answer and then they'll think about it. So it's really similar to how a researcher would go through it. So that's Crow. We have something called Finch, which is the data analysis agent. This is something that basically tries to build a Jupyter notebook to explore a data set. So you upload 20, 25 files. They can all be 5 gigs each. And then you give it some kind of task. Look at this data set and make an interesting plot. Okay, that's the weakest thing you could ask it, but that's an example of something you could ask it. And it'll go through and build a Jupyter notebook cell by cell. And at the end, you'll get a Jupyter notebook that you can execute to repeat the analysis. It'll give you some plots and an answer. And there's one that does a precedent search. Has anybody done X? And this one can look through clinical trials. It can look through patents. It can look through previously published literature and see, has anybody tried this idea that you have before? And so we have written some papers where we string these agents together to automate repurposing a drug to treat a disease. And they work really well for this. And I think what really is remarkable about these kind of systems is the scale, right? They can entertain hundreds or thousands of hypotheses simultaneously. They can just operate at a very vast scale. And some of them are as good as humans. Some of them are better than humans. Some of them we haven't measured and we're not sure yet. Like the data analysis one, we haven't really figured out what's the average human for data analysis yet. We're working on that right now. But they really just can basically do this sort of vast, scaled up horizontal discovery process. And then another part of our org is working what I would call very sharp vertical models, which are very intelligent at a specific task. I can talk about more of that if we're interested. But that is sort of the most public facing thing is all these things. A lot of them are open source. We have an API that people can use to call them. So if, an API to do literature search or to do precedent search can be really enabling in your own work on building agents for discovery.
Yeah, recently I think you guys proclaimed something like a step towards superhuman insight specifically. And that was a quite interesting and quite actionable scientific discovery, potentially. Could you discuss that a little bit more?
Yeah. One of the problems in my life, and I think many people's life, is that you build tools and then you hope that someone will use the tools to do something great. And I have had problems with that in the past. And when we built Future House, we really wanted to have people inside using the tools to make discoveries. Because, there's this chicken and egg problem. I'll build a tool and hope someone uses it, but maybe they use it for the wrong thing or something. So we have a wet lab, a physical wet lab in Future House. And we have scientists that go in and try to use our tools to make discoveries. And so things have been going pretty well. So we tried to build basically a process to discover a new treatment based on a new mechanism for a disease. And so we hired an ophthalmologist, Ali is his name, and he's an MD, and he helped us kind of come up with a plan to treat dry AMD. So dry AMD is the most common cause of blindness in elderly people in the US and I think internationally. And it's not really known how to treat this disease. There's not really any good approved drugs. There's things that can reduce some of the symptoms, just like taking eye drops to reduce, irritation, but you will go blind over time with this disease. So we asked our system to come up with, as many ideas as possible. So hypothesized about a lot of ideas about how this disease could be treated. And then it used things like OWL to see, has anybody tried this before? If so, was it good? Was it bad? And then, based on these ideas that I think could be good, what are experiments we could do in our lab? So then what were the experiments we could do in the lab? So then we did those experiments. Then we provided the raw data to Finch, our data analysis agent, said, analyze this data and see how it looks. And then Finch made all the plots in the paper, the eventual paper we released on this. And then it went back and said, okay, here's the results from the experiments. Here's, what we learned. What should we do next? And then it proposed, specific compounds to try to treat this in the cell model. And we came up with a compound, ripisutal, which is an existing drug for a different condition. And we found that it actually basically hit the mechanism that we proposed, which is basically accelerating how your macrophages can sort of clear debris out of the eyes. And that, we think, is a potential treatment for dry AMD. Now, I think the exciting part about this is, we picked a goal like treat AMD. And the system went all the way through to propose a drug and give us cell-based evidence for it. And it's like, there's no tox issues. So this is a drug repurposing. So there's not like a lot of clinical trials that have to be done. But then, you have to go put in dry AMD patients in humans at the end to prove that it will work. But it, got so much farther than, research programs that could take years. And it did it in, I think the whole project took maybe 3 weeks. And a lot of those 3 weeks was the actual experiments. The actual computational work took maybe, I don't know, maybe 12 hours total. And so this is like a real demonstration that this approach can work. And there's a lot of caveats here. Like we had to think about like, how do people go about repurposing drugs? We had to make sure that we said things like, make sure you think first about the mechanism, then think about the drug. We had to say things like, our lab only has these pieces, of equipment, and these are the cell lines we could use. So there's still some caveats, but I think it really demonstrates, it gives you a glimpse of where the future lies for this work.
Yeah, I think, you guys claimed that there's like a path to superhuman insight. And, I guess like on that note, you have also, dug yourself deep into like different benchmarking and how they fare versus not fair. One specifically, I think that you guys recently published on was Humanity's Last Exam, which I'm sure many people that are listening to the podcast are familiar with, but maybe you could briefly outline that. And what do you think of even like the benchmarks of how we are currently measuring tasks of humans versus AIs? And then specifically, what's wrong with Humanity's Last Exam?
Yeah, I was on a panel a couple months ago, and we were talking about like how AI is impacting different domains. And I was there representing, I don't know, like science or something, and somebody's there representing medicine. And they were saying like, basically AI in medicine is something which is just, it makes no sense to build evals, right? Like every patient is different, and like case reports, a doctor will pick up on things from talking to the patient that just can't really be represented in the case reports. And it's very rare that a doctor walks into the, to the patient room and all of the assays are done, all the lab results are back, and there's written up notes, and they just look at all of it and say, yes, you have, whatever, you have a UTI or something. So their argument for AI medicine is that you need to treat these systems like a resident. Basically, you walk around with it and you work with it for whatever, a few months or a year, and then you decide, yes, you are good enough to be an independent practitioner or something. And I think that might be, basically at a certain point, you just have to treat these like a trainee, in your profession, and you have to evaluate them based on how well they can, accomplish your job end to end. So I think that's like where we want to get to, right? Like basically you want to get to the point where you as an expert can work with these systems and be confident that it could do your job independently and say, great, you will go off and now be a doctor. Of course, the difference is that if an AI passes residency, you can copy that thing n times, and now you've replaced a lot of medicine. So I think there are some consequential differences when you're done with the process. But I think that the actual evaluation is maybe similar to how we evaluate humans. Now then, let's bring it back. So then there's these evals. There's things like Humanity's Last Exam, which is an open answer and multiple choice test that measures how good AI systems are at doing what was characterized as frontier level research. And I think this is great. What's really nice about a written test is you can repeatedly test it over and over again in different parts of the world with different systems. You can all agree that you're measuring the same thing. Whereas if you have, a doctor or a person watching the system, you may not agree on what is important or what is not important. It's really hard to know that eval. I guess that's maybe the vibes-based eval in a more favorable light than like these written tests. But we run into this problem where like people are trying to hit multiple objectives in building these evals. And this is actually like an issue, is that when you build a new eval, you go and you build the eval, and it might turn out that you finish it and then the LLM gets 99% on it. And suddenly you wasted all this time of building an eval, and frontier models can ace it. So when you build an eval now, you have to think carefully about making sure that LLMs can't answer it all correctly. So Humanity's Last Exam was built trying to hit a bunch of different objectives. One of them was that it was crowdsourced. Basically, you have people providing questions. They're not professional question writers. They're not even necessarily experts in the domain. They're basically providing questions. And then you have an assessment process where people say, okay, let's see if this is a good question. And it's because we're at the frontier of human knowledge. The real assessment for Humanity's Last Exam was like, can frontier LLMs get the question right or not? And so there's this requirement that frontier LLMs can't get the question right. And this leads you down to these questions, which are either like, A, there's not enough context in the question for anyone to get it right. That's a way that a frontier LM couldn't get it right. B, it can be like a truly frontier level question, like a really hard math problem that they just can't get right. Or C, it can be a kind of gotcha question where like you're sort of trying to trick the person answering it. And the example we gave in our write-up was like, as of 2002, I'm going to get this question wrong, this 2002, what is the rarest noble gas among terrestrial matter? So basically, if you were to take Earth and grind it all up and characterize the elements that are on Earth in the noble gas category, what's the rarest of them? And if you go read any papers, on this topic, they have terrestrial accounting of noble gases. It's an important question. Some of them, like xenon, are just like in the atmosphere. They're very rare. Some of them, like radium, basically come out of the Earth from decay of uranium. I'm sorry, radon, not radium, radon. And that one is very rare on Earth, and you can disagree on like how much there is because, whether you take it, near the Earth's surface or at the top, it's at different levels of degradation. Anyway, it's like an actual thing that people write research papers on. But the trick of this one was that like in 2002 in Russia, some people did an experiment where they created a few atoms that are in the same column on the periodic table of noble gases. And people argue about what is a noble gas. Like a noble gas, according to IUPAC, which is like a big group of chemists that just make names of things, they say a noble gas is something which is in this column of the periodic table of elements. Some people say noble gas it has to be a gas, right? Like it's in the name, and it has to be like non-reactive. And so this thing is not a gas, it's a solid, it's very reactive, it decays immediately. And so like it's a question of, well, is this really part of terrestrial matter in 2002? I don't know. But anyway, the point is that this question has nothing to do with can you go do research and are you at the frontier of your field? The question's on a game show, it's like one of these trivia gotcha questions. And what we did in analyzing humanities last exam is we wanted to know if you take the question in the answer and you turn it into a statement. And so the statement now says, oganesson, that's the name of this atom, is the rarest noble gas among terrestrial matter in 2002. If you take that statement, then we check to see has anybody written a paper that contradicts this statement? Because when they made humanities last exam, they rightfully said it needs to be what they call a univocal answer. That is, any scientist, the average scientist, 90% of scientists would agree that this is a true statement if you look at it. And no scientist would agree that's a true statement. This is the most common terrestrial noble gas on Earth. There's multiple papers contradicting this, saying that, whatever, xenon is the rarest gas or radon is the rarest gas. Anyway, so we applied this standard. Like if you turn the question into a statement, how often is it contradicted by peer-reviewed literature? And it turns out a lot of them are contradicted by peer-reviewed literature. And we hired independent contractors to look at this, and they evaluated a large number of them. We used our AI agents to basically find the papers that contradict them ahead of time so that we could sort of accelerate this process. And we found that 30% were contradicted by the literature in a pretty clear way. There's a lot of them that are sort of on the boundary. But anyway, at the end of the day, it's, this humanities last exam was built according to the incentives of the question writers. And the incentive of the question writers was make sure current LLMs get the questions wrong. Why did they get them wrong? Well, sometimes it was like just a trick question, or they actually just got it completely wrong. Like one of them, somebody used their source as a PowerPoint to write a question, and that PowerPoint presentation itself had a mistake. And so then the question had a mistake, but then the person reviewing the question read the PowerPoint as well, because if you Google it, that's the most common return result in the web. And so then like ChatGPT Deep Research gets the question right for a while because it was reading the PowerPoint slide, until something changed on the rankings on the internet, that there was this FDA guidance document that's now the number one ranked Google result. So then now ChatGPT Deep Research gets the question wrong according to HLE, but actually right factually. Anyway, so this is just, it's kind of a mess. And I think we're just running out of steam here where people can actually write questions that frontier LLMs get wrong because they're not smart enough, because we're just scraping the boundary of knowledge. And so when we think about what are the right questions to work on now at Future House, we just say, okay, how many fundamental new discoveries can our systems make? And if that's the measure, because, if we do that every time we get a new discovery, we're advancing scientific knowledge and evaluating the systems at the same time. So that's where we want to be. But of course, we're not all the way there yet.
That was a mouthful to digest. If you are trying to apply that learning, to the scientific ecosystem in general, what's there to learn? Because humanities last exam is still, one of the kind of like standards out there that people are trying to get after.
Yeah. I mean, this is where it gets hard. Like, how do you agree that systems are getting better and better? I think you see competition level mathematics becoming a more popular standard because competition level mathematics Like we have a really good calibration of what is a hard math problem. You go to chemistry, what is a hard chemistry problem? It's not really universally agreed upon. Sometimes things are really hard in chemistry because it's not stable at room temperature, or things are really hard because you need some stereoselective catalyst and it doesn't exist yet, right? It's a very difficult field because it's grounded in the physical world. So how do we measure stuff like that? Well, basically at Future House, we make evals. Like we made one called Bioinformatics Benchmark, which is basically where you give someone a hypothesis that you're trying to study in a data set, and then you ask it, can you answer questions about this hypothesis? It's okay. I don't think it's the best eval we've ever built, but that one is one that frontier LLMs get like 20% on. We're building another one right now, which we're calling internally like LitQA3. And this one is what I would call like high recall tasks. So right now, agents are really good at precision. Humanities exam is a very precision level task. Go find this one fact. We're trying to build evals that are what I would call recall tasks, like basically find every paper that studied X, do a meta-analysis to find out if X is true or false, and then give me statistics on, whether that's true or not. That is a great question because the current agents really don't do well at very incorporating a whole bunch of information. So that's something we're working on right now. So that's what an eval we're working on right now is. But I think that the idea that there's going to be one number like MMLU Pro or HLE, there's going to be one number that characterizes models, I think we might be leaving that era. And it's going to be like a lot of really hard work. And so maybe composite evals, like I know Scale AI has a composite eval. I think Salesforce or something has like a business intelligence composite eval. I don't know how those work. I have to look at those more carefully, but I think we need to build something like a science composite eval that looks at a whole bunch of different areas. Or we just need to be like, okay, we're going to judge them like we judge researchers. And, the eval is write a paper on these 10 topics and we see how people grade them. And that sucks. It's not a great eval because it's not repeatable and it's like very subjective. But we might be reaching the point where these systems are so good that it's not really possible to write a multiple choice set of questions that they look at.
Yeah. Yeah, it's mimicking the world, though. Yeah, it's pretty complex and messy, and as we're advancing more, and especially as we're getting to this frontier, even of human knowledge, especially as on the ecosystem of human knowledge, it's probably not going to get easier or more straightforward over time. When you think about your long-term goal, I know that you set 3 different goals depending on your optimism on the day of Future House, but just of generally the AI for science field, really the goal of automating scientific discovery and the R&D process in general. How do you see this ultimately benefiting the real world? So what, for example, diseases do you think we might be able to solve with the work that you and many other actors that are currently gearing up in the AI for science field are doing? Where's the kind of maximum existential hope vision here in the next 5 years or so? If everything goes right, what could we solve?
Yeah. Okay. So for diseases, I am of a generation of a whole bunch of very sad cynics. I've lived through the Human Genome Project, where we thought if we could just look at the entire human genome, we could cure diseases. That didn't really pan out. Then there was the high throughput sequencing, this high throughput imaging. Then there's transcriptomics and antibodies. And I don't know, there's been so many times when we thought we've basically cracked human biology, and it's really blocked us at every turn. And so I think I'm a very pessimist when it comes to curing all diseases. Now, with that said, though, I have hopes that our approach is maybe one cognitive level higher than what has been done in the past. We're not trying to automate curing biology by building one really good, viral delivery system or one really good modality or one really good, way of looking at targets. We're trying to automate the process of scientific discovery with the understanding that there will be no one silver bullet. We're just going to try to make the bullets faster, I guess, or make more bullets faster, something like this. So I think we need to be able to go after diseases that are more complex, right? So in many diseases, if we take, I don't know, I would normally say obesity, but obesity had a very simple solution, which was actually just one of those funny things about life. Metabolic diseases, okay, fine. There's some diseases that are very complex, and it may not be that there's one magic pill that solves them. And so you need to actually get a lot of understanding. Or maybe there is a magic pill for some complex disease. Maybe we'll find a magic pill for Parkinson's one day. But definitely right now, those diseases have so much research, so many papers, so much information that nobody's able to synthesize all of that and really pursue multiple hypotheses at once. And I think Alzheimer's is a great example of this. Everybody's human, right? The people doing discovery are human. And in Alzheimer's research, it's such a complicated disease that sort of human personalities, how much people could convince other people, became a pretty big factor in what were the pursued research directions. And this led to a lot of people working on these A beta peptides as like the causal agent in Alzheimer's research. And now we know that from multiple failed clinical trials and cases of fraud where people were faking, foundational results in the field, we know that sort of hypothesis is not really the most important, compelling hypothesis. And still, even today, I think people still would rate it as the number one hypothesis among the community. And so we're really sort of scraping where like a big community of researchers can actually cure a disease, because it's too much information for everyone. So everyone has to pick their sort of internal compass. And that internal compass that people have is influenced by charisma of researchers. It's influenced by, who's giving the keynote at the next, conference, or who are the senior researchers. So I think I have hopes that this kind of automation of discovery can basically provide a more unbiased pursuit of lots of hypotheses in complex diseases. But I don't think we've built a magic bullet. I think what we've built is an accelerator so that as we get like new ideas, like our agents can use Boltz 2. Boltz 2 is a very new, exciting open source model that's like AlphaFold 3 in designing small molecule binders. Our agents can use, ESM, right? ESM is a very powerful protein language model that's used for manipulating protein designs. Every time these new tools come in, we can basically put them in our system quickly. And so we're able to accelerate the outer loop of science, which is where like a PhD student has to learn how to use a method, has to learn how to install the code, and then try a couple ideas. We're able to automate that outer loop. And so I hope we can accelerate diseases there faster. So anyway, I don't know if I answered the question directly, but this is sort of how I'm thinking about the process.
And is that your maxed out full throttle existential vision of where we could be in 5 years? Just, I guess, more bullets. None of them are silver. All of them are differently colored, a beautiful rainbow of bullets. No, but like, in all seriousness, if you think about like full throttle existential hope, like what's the kind of like outer limit of, if not only your research or like your work goes well, but like also that of various other actors that are currently entering the AI for science space, where could we be in terms of AI for science in 5 years? What's realistic, but also optimistic?
Yeah. Okay. So if I can use my magic wand, basically we would have, a big overhaul of the FDA so that approvals are automated, so that trial design is done by some kind of machine system so that basically we all can accelerate that process. More tolerance of creative endpoints, right? So a big overhaul of regulatory, right? So that's, if you want to have an impact in 5 years, we have to have a big overhaul in regulatory part. On the other side of things, some people are concerned about the speed of pharmaceutical work in China, but I think that actually this is a really great thing for patients. So basically, China's pharmaceutical industry has industrialized a lot of the preclinical discovery work. And so right now, we're really like, basically, we can go from target to compound in human in China very fast. Now, a lot of the target research is still done in the US, and some people see this as like an adversarial thing, but I think it's also like a de-risking thing. It's like China's making this work with the regulatory changes relative to the US and with like more focus on automation and scale up. So we can do the same thing in the US. So I think, if we can push really big level changes on the regulatory side, on like preclinical speed, and on the work we're doing on automating the finding of targets, right? And automating the early discovery work, and then great work from, like Peyton's company, Big Hat, is really making antibodies be discovered faster, like the work from getting small molecules discovered faster. Isomorphic Lab is working on this as well. I think all of these things could work together and make a really fast speed up. And you can see evidence of acceleration, right? Like, the GLP-1 work, right? We went from a peptide from Novo Nordisk down to a once daily pill in a matter of, 3 years or something, very quick speed. And now Lilly has this once daily pill. And so, the speed at which we can go from like a target to something that can modulate the target to a once daily pill is getting faster. And so I have high hopes about it, but I think, there's so many things out of control of me as a player in this space. Like what happens to the FDA, I've no control over that, right? The FDA could get worse, right? Or like on the other side of things, like the sort of the feedstock for finding targets is like academic research, right? Like a lot of the stuff that we do is we accelerate academic research, or we can like parse through academic research faster. But the input, like oil to this process, is academic research, and NIH is getting its budget gutted, right? And NSF is getting its budget gutted, and with inflations and tariffs, right? That input to this process is slowing down. And so maybe like more work has to be done. Maybe things like what Emerald Cloud Labs is doing, or what Ginkgo Bioworks is doing on automating some of the fundamental research, maybe that's an important component for this. But there's so much stuff going on. I don't know. I know like the theme is existential hope. So I think there is definitely hope for huge improvements here. all the ingredients are here, but it's like such a funny thing where it's not really like a techno-economic solution. It's almost like a policy and will and where we focus our work.
Yep. I think you named a few of the bottlenecks that come up in almost every single foresight workshop. We usually have a grieving session on the second day of a technical workshop, let's say an AI for bio or AI for neuro workshop. It starts the second day where like we list all the institutional nightmares that people are collectively facing just to get them out there. And then we're like, okay, now let's table them for now. Let's imagine they're solved. What are the scientific solutions that you'd be coming up with? They still nevertheless, of course, demand and deserve solving. One that you particularly have your eyes on was especially the scientific publishing ecosystem. And I know that like HUMHO has also published something, quite rebellious at OpenEd at Astera recently on the scientific publishing system. But you in particular have a draft out right now that goes something like publishing for machines. And it's definitely, I think, something that is like relatively universally observed that, as scientific research and progress is accelerating, the kind of, traditional straitjackets of the journal industrial complex aren't cutting it anymore. So if that is a thing that we need to reinvent or potentially entirely new invent, the sharing and learning from each other's research, what is your go-to strategy for doing that better?
Yeah. I want to talk about, just about what you said too for a minute here is that I think it can be very easy to be pessimistic right now about the state of science. But I think somewhere I hold hope in this is that I think science has kind of reached an ossification as well, like institutionally. Like we've almost reached a point where like the direction of science is almost like self-fulfilling. Like academics choose what they think is important, and then academics pursue that. And it was a very, I would say, it's become disconnected from like societal impact. So I think some of the huge like negative changes that are happening in science right now will lay the sort of foundation for, I'm hoping, like a revival of science in a more socially aligned direction. And so I have a lot of hope that some of the stuff that's happening in politics and some of the things that are changing and, where people go to train or how people think about institutions, I'm hoping that sort of is going to be sort of a kind of like a forest fire or something that then leads to a rebirth of how we consider our directions. So I'm hopeful that we'll have an opportunity here to move science in a way that I don't think was possible 2 years ago or 3 years ago because of the entrenchment of the institutions. So, but then back to publishing, I think publishing is another great example of, it's an unsustainable, ossified thing that we don't know how to break out of. And I want to also start this by saying that I don't think it's just like publishers are bad, right? I think that's a very simplistic idea of this system, is that every day scientists choose to continue participating in this system. And whenever we look at, oh, was this in science? Well, then it must be taken seriously. Oh, was this in Frontiers? It should not be taken seriously. Or, oh, was this on bioRxiv? Well, we know bioRxiv is not peer reviewed, so we don't take it seriously, but it's published in Cell. Well, then it's going to be taken seriously. And so I think we're all like active participants in this process. And it's not just like publishers are holding us hostage. But then, forget publishers or anything like that. We just have a problem with the speed of science. Every country has scaled up scientific researchers. Every country has realized this is an engine for their economy. And so there's just more people doing science every year. And so I think some people like to just shut out that idea, right? It's just, I think you see this in like an altruism, right? Is that it's very easy to ignore bad things happening in other parts of the world because it's just like part of our brains are wired to focus on our community. Some people just ignore science happening in India or China or in Africa because they just want to say it's all bad, or they just want to dismiss it all because it's in less good journals, because it helps them focus on, just what they can comprehend. So I think we have an information overload as well, because there is going to be a time at which there's not just, 10,000 important researchers in the United States or something in Europe. There's going to be 100,000 or 1,000,000 researchers that are all doing important work. So publishing is, of course, a symptom of that sort of narrow view we have right now of this industrialization of science. Like it's becoming to be like not it's not like a bunch of cowboys, or it's not like a professional guild anymore. It's like a professional industrialized class of people doing science everywhere. So we see this, there's 250 million papers now. There's 6 to 7 million papers coming out every year. We're at an all-time high for submissions to arXiv and bioRxiv. Nobody can possibly read all the papers that are coming out. And it's not because it's all bad. I think that's just too simplistic. It's because there's a lot of science coming out. So in this blog post that I put together, this essay, I'm arguing that we need to start thinking about the consumers and producers of science are machines, because we're reaching the point where human beings are not going to be able to comprehend all the information there, or even want to be comprehending all the information there. And so this was sort of the impetus of we have to figure out how to deal with this huge influx of science, and also this big, tectonic shift in where science is done and how well science is done. Anyway.
Well, explain, please. We've had some kind of movement already where, people definitely tweet. I think it was definitely accelerated by the pandemic, where people are just like, okay, the rubber hits the road. We need to have scientific discoveries actually shaping the real world vaccination discovery process much faster. And so people they did what worked, right? They got much scrappier. They were publishing on bioRxiv much faster. They just were figuring it out on Twitter, aka X.
Yep.
And I think that mentality kind of stuck with us for some time. And so to some extent that had left the traditional publishing ecosystem behind, in terms of like when people want to share research fast, that is the way that they do it. And then nevertheless, they still publish or try to publish in the big journals, but that's more almost pat on the back in hindsight after the science has already been out or proliferated in other ways. So if we now think about AI as being the main producer, but also consumer of scientific research in the next 5 to 10 years, how do the kind of like scientific publishing ecosystem, how does it have to change to accommodate for that? Like, how can we build for that from the get-go now that we know that it's happening?
Yeah, I have in my essay, I wrote a few ideas of what this looks like, but I think I have low conviction that I've, solved it alone. But I think some of the most important things are latency, right? Like the time from someone finishing a project to it being reported out. As you said, in the pandemic, latency was like a something that we all recognize as a big problem in publishing. And then post-pandemic, just the peer review pool has been eaten up, and like it just takes months and months for papers to be published. And so I think people are taking peer review less seriously because it's almost become a lagging indicator. And like a paper being great or not great is already decided well before the peer reviews come back, because of preprint servers and things like that. So I think latency is one of the most important things we have to change. Basically, if we really believe we're accelerating science, we can't have a 6-month lag time. It's, just the biggest latency in this work. Another thing in there is that, for machines reading papers, the PDF has been a disaster, and I think paywalls have been a disaster for scientific corpus. Basically, right now, language models are trained on the internet because the internet's free and open and you can download the whole thing. Science should have been what we train language models on. It is it's a more faithful representation of the world. It represents hundreds of years of research. It's better connected, right? Every article has clear citations to other articles, and they're not like just, these hyperlinks that can be they can be meaningless on websites. But we've lost that, right? It didn't happen. And that's sort of a fault of ours. But what was that quote? The best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is now, right? We need to start changing how we represent science. And so I have in the essay a little bit about, I think, what are the key components of a research paper? I think we need to slim down research papers as well. Again, because of sort of professional standards, articles published in Cell and Science and Nature are just so much information, and it's all shoved into the supporting information, and the figures are so complicated. It's reaching a point where now, like, the atomic unit of science is not really like a discovery. The atomic unit of science is like a 5-year project that someone needs to get out the door so that they can go out of the faculty market. So that has to change as well, as I think we need to have slimmer papers. And then another thing is that, it used to be that journals would publish most any important work, and like whether it would go to science or whether it would go to physical, chemistry B, was a matter of whether it would be interesting for the readers. Now it's become just a prestige signal. And so again, this is something that slows down science, is that we basically have to have this artificial scarcity mindset of articles. And that has to change. It just shouldn't be a part of the scientific publishing process. We shouldn't need to select how important work is when we go to publish it. I think the curation has to be separate. And then peer review as well. Like, how do we fix peer review? It's very broken. I think we just need to separate out, like, there's peer review for making sure that it's not scummy, like spammy work. There's peer review to make sure it's, faithfully citing papers and there's not duplicated images and it's like a coherent paper. But then there's peer review, which is like the debate of science. And I think that part of peer review is very important, but it shouldn't be hidden in peer review. There's some kind of coupling that happened a long time ago where, like, this sort of gatekeeping to make sure it's actually scientific work has been coupled with the private debate of where the field is. And I think we got to pull that out of peer review. So I think there needs to be some kind of a category of publications where people critique each other. That is going to be super hard. I almost feel like that is like something that just scientists are exceedingly polite in public. Of course, some scientists are rude and that's, their thing. But I think 99% of scientists are very professional and very polite. And that's become like a kind of a persona of being a scientist is are polite to your colleagues. But then when it comes time for the private critique and peer review process, when it's anonymous and it is like determining whether paper comes in or goes out of a journal, they're not super nice. And that's where the debate happens. And so, but that we got to figure out a way to get that out of there, get that back into the public. So anyway, I think there's like I have a lot of ideas in this essay. I guess it's just, I think there's a mindset shift if we need to like recognize that we need to be writing for machines as a big reader, and we need to be understanding that producers of research will be machines soon. And there are some changes that we should make. Because otherwise, the alternative is that people like Future House or people like Google co-scientists or Anthropic, people that are building these AI scientists to do research, they'll just publish for themselves, right? They don't want to mess around with submitting to sell. We're not going to mess around submitting a bunch of papers to Nature. We can't afford publication fees. And we don't wait around and there's all these forms you have to fill out. It's a lot of work, right? So we'll just start building our own parallel corpus of science. And if we don't have this sort of shared resource anymore, this community goods, then it'll be a tragedy and I think be a pretty big setback for science.
Yeah, it's so interesting, I think, to zoom out and just look at the broader ecosystem and the effects that individual players that are gearing up have on that. Like, I think another area where that's TBD to some extent is the general, like, in the future, is it mostly going to be like a process of centralization of intelligence or specialization? So, for example, one could imagine a future in which, if I want to have a scientific question answered, I use deep research, ChatGPT-5, or just, one of the major labs agents, and that one agent can pretty much answer any questions on any topic. And another future is one where you have many different organizations, perhaps Future House is one, many other different kind of like specialized entities producing super intelligent specialists that are really super intelligent on one specific scientific domain, let's say, or like a class of domains, and that you have more of an ecosystem in which these different super intelligent specialists kind of like collaborate to finding the right answer. So where you'd rather go to a specialist in a specific industry to answer a question. And I think one reason, spoiler alert, why I'm so excited about Future House is because I think I view as more setting up this more decentralized, specialized path of intelligence where, there's like a new kind of ecosystem that is currently emerging, of which you are a player of, where you can have very focused questions on different scientific domains and get them answered very accurately, and where there's this interplay of many different specialists. And I'm really curious to hear, are you thinking about this at all? About like how is this all going to play out in the kind of race up to AGI? Do you see yourself as, a player in that kind of like meta game? And if so, how do you see Future House contributing to that like larger kind of AI and AGI ecosystem?
Yeah. I mean, I think you've hit on the crux here, and I think it comes down to, do you believe that we can solve scientific problems from first principles, or do they require some sort of empirical measurement? And so there may be some centralization of like mathematics. There may be just the best system for doing math, because math is, I mean, I guess to some extent there is a field of experimental math where people run calculations. They like write code and do simulations. But a lot of math is like really just sort of symbolic. Whereas if you go to biology, maybe we build the most intelligent thing ever and it's, able to intuit everything, but it still can't tell me like the cells in my hand, like what, will change their, phenotype, right? Or what will make them grow better, because that thing just can't see the cells in my hand, right? There has to be some kind of process of measurement. There has to be some kind of empirical measurement. And so I believe that many scientific problems, many research problems require some kind of, tool or some kind of measuring device. And I think that's what will separate these two hypothesized futures of a centralization of intelligence and like a distribution of intelligence, is that fundamentally we live in a physical world. And so there's going to be some locality, right? Like maybe ChatGPT can have a webcam and it can go, and maybe you have a haptic suit you put on and can feel what you feel. But really at the end of the day, like there's just some tools that can't just be derived from pure symbolic reasoning. And so I think there will always be room, or there'll always be such a role where like Maybe it's a simulation, right? Or maybe it's a database lookup. These things are not, ChatGPT 8 is not going to memorize all sequence information from all organisms ever on Earth. Or maybe it does, but then the next day there's a whole bunch of new sequences that come out in the world. So there's always going to be a role for these tools. And these tools are like looking up data, like, using simulation, and then going to be physical measurements. So I think those things just can't escape the process of discovery. They can't escape intelligence, or intelligence can't escape those. So I think there'll always be a role for these decentralized things. Now, how does Future House fit into this? I don't know. I think of Future House as it's a research institute. Like, we're trying to solve research problems. So the legacy of Future House is probably going to be demonstrating that this is possible. But Future House is whatever, 25 people, and we don't have an endowment, right? So I don't know if Future House is going to really be the big player at the billion-dollar scale. So I don't know if Future House will be the one that solves this or that is a huge player in this. But I think we're definitely showing that this is possible, and I think we're definitely showing how to make progress in this area.
Yeah, I guess one normative argument that people sometimes make for let's have it all be centralized in the big labs, more or less at least, is the fact that with the proliferation of scientific knowledge also comes the proliferation of potential knowledge to do harm or to, combine some dangerous capabilities into something that can, produce like a small kills all risk in bio or cyber or what have you. And, as like more or less believers and defenders of the open source and open science community, at least like we are at Foresight, we have a bias towards that. I would say in general, I would sense that you might also have the same bias, especially as one of the producers of agents that are more on the specialized end. How do we kind of address these very real risks head on without being Pollyannish about them?
Yeah. I mean, from a philosophical point of view, concentrating as much power into a few people as a way to prevent some sort of catastrophic event seems like the opposite idea, right? And so I think, I don't want to sound cynical on this, but I think like bio has become the mechanism for like why this needs to happen. But I think as far as, bio being a risk area, I think biology has by far the highest activation energy for like actually causing risk. If you look at some very, dark times in history when people have tried to cause, do terrorist attacks or cause harm, biology has always been entertained by them and then immediately dismissed, right? And so the Japanese terror attacks, I think in the 90s, they tried to do anthrax and it didn't really work very well. And they realized chemical weapons is a much easier thing to go after, but then it required building a big factory. So they had to find a way to buy a factory. It was actually just a ton of work. And so I think when I think about what are the risks of AI right now or in the short term, I think it's got to be more things in cybersecurity, right? And I think that's where there's just no activation energy to use these systems. And what is a great way to protect against cybersecurity? I think it's like a distribution of intelligence, not a concentration of intelligence. But anyway, I think I'm not as informed on cybersecurity, but I think to some extent, bio has become like a boogeyman for why open source can't exist. And I think it's a weird boogeyman to use because bio is, I think, intrinsically just very hard because of the physical world, not because of any sort of open questions. To give a specific example, people like to talk about resurrecting smallpox and killing everyone on Earth with it as like a bio risk. You can download the sequence for smallpox. It's on the internet. It's been on the internet for many years. The question is not like, what is the information in it? It's like, how do you go through the tedious task of actually assembling the genome for the virus and getting it to human cells? So it's not really a field which is intelligence limited. But now how do we try to take these risks seriously? Because there are risks, and definitely the risks will grow as intelligence grows. And I think any sort of plan to control all information in one centralized source is such a weak, I think, strategy. I think it has to be something that's...
It's a honeypot too.
Yeah, it's a honeypot too. Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. But I think it has to be something like with multiple layers of defense, right? Like in the bio, right? Like people trying to work on DNA screening technology. We could put more money into that, right? There's biosurveillance, people working on like wastewater surveillance of things. People who make LLMs, they try to prevent it from just doing easy biology, just doing dangerous work. We put some safeguards on there. There's also professional training. Like whenever you have a lab, you have to go through safety training. And there's also some screening of people who can work in the lab with dangerous reagents. There's KYC and ordering reagents. So I think there's like lots of boring, dumb ideas that just have to be done and will help protect against this. And I think any sort of grand single shot solution that involves concentrating all the intelligence in one area and then, monitoring the input and output from the system, I just think it's just intuitively a very high risk approach, right? It's just, if you try to put everything into one system, it's just naturally a high risk thing. And there have been incidents in labs where people exfiltrate weights, right? There have been incidents where people can use an unfiltered model by getting around safeguards. It's definitely something that I think is just, we have to understand that that's not a single solution for all issues.
Yeah, really creating a single point of failure through either a honeypot for extortion, for exfiltration of information, for attack, for shutdown, for for accidents, etc. to occur. So I do think the decentralization of scientific capabilities also means the decentralization of some of the risks thereof, right? And so I'm hoping that also, I guess one thing that the open science community, I think, would have to contend with is not just sitting idly by, but also creating more of an open source, intelligent open source monitoring, open source democratic appeal for what are some of the risks that we should be watching out for so that we can catch actors early in this kind of like more federated intelligence network. So I don't think we can just, go along as we please, but there do need to be some tools that have to be built, but they can be built in the open, I think, by a variety of actors keeping each other in check. And ultimately, I think that just intuitively sounds like a more safer to go, but there's stuff to be built for sure.
Yeah.
If you think about perhaps, a final question, I know that we're nearing time here, but, we at Foresight, we've been giving grants in the AI space now for a few years. We've had an 8-year fellowship where lots of people are using AI for bio, neuro, etc. We give prizes in this area. And, overall, it seems that space is very rapidly emerging and just like really flourishing. There's just a ton of really interesting projects in the AI for science domain out there. And I think we're just getting started, right? Like this AI for science revolution is really, we're on the cusp of it. We're not even, we barely got going on this. I think it's really exciting. If I just look at all the applications that we're getting, I couldn't possibly be more excited about what's ahead. I think there's tremendous opportunity and possibility. We're hoping to possibly support more projects by also enabling more of these AI for science hubs to just catch some of their talent. But if you are like an early career scientist thinking about how to use AI to advance your work, you as someone who has done that and created tools for that, what would you advise for someone who's an early career scientist and entrant getting their fingers wet on using some of the AI for science tools? How should they position themselves to really leverage the opportunity that field represents?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what you want to do is experiment a lot, but also I think you need to really train your ability to critique and be honest with yourself. I think we've had some people get started in AI for science here at Future House, and these models are getting so good that you can like really think you've built something amazing, but you have to like keep that sort of very critical scientific eye on what you're making and making sure that you really have discovered something good. So I think making sure you know how to evaluate work in an unbiased way, making sure you're ready to be honest and critiquing what you think you've made, that's important skills to keep. How do you get started on really doing creative, cool stuff? Yeah, I think the open source ecosystem here is very mature at this point. There's a lot of really good like projects, like these MCP servers are coming along. There is lots of really good scaffolding for putting LLMs with tools. We have built some stuff at Future House. We have something called Aviary, which is like a way to put together scientific agents. Our platform you can use to do precedent search. So in some ways, like a lot of the tools are there, and it's like we're looking for people to try cool ideas. I think I don't know if it's another difference in getting into AI for science versus other domains is that there is this issue of, okay, I need to get an OpenAI account, or I need to get like an Anthropic account to get at the cutting edge right now. And I think the open source inference is actually becoming harder. So in the old days, like with a relatively small amount of GPUs, you could compete with open source, with open weights models. But nowadays, actually, GPUs are becoming more scarce for people in AI for science, in an academic setting, or even in a research institute. The compute requirements for running these open source models is actually becoming an issue. And so I think there's also this question of like, how do you make progress on a light compute budget or using frontier LLMs? Another thing that is exciting is I think some of the work on non-LLMs are still really cool. Like people exploring graph neural networks to like describe the relationships between agents or use equivariant neural networks to try to like model some of these things at an all atom level. So I think we don't want to leave behind some of the really cool directions of machine learning and go only for language models. Anyway, I don't know, this is not really great advice. I guess it's just, we're at the turn of the century, right? Like when the atomic revolution was happening, people were discovering what is an atom, what is a neutron, people were discovering radiation and X-rays and relativity, and we're at like another one of these crazy inflection points, and nobody knows what's the right answer. And so I think, just be a member of the community to keep a pace, have an open mind, but keep that critical scientific eye, because I think there's a lot of traps you can fall into these days with AI, because it can be so alluring and it does really want to be helpful, harmless, and that can be it can be a trap. But also, get that hacker mindset of exploring stuff quickly and try it out.
Yeah, on the compute and community angle, we are likely about to launch some physical hubs where you have not only physical co-located compute that can be used for AI and science projects, but also some grant funding, some kind of community creation in the AI for science world. Because I think often many of these projects are kind of like rebels that are like flying in the dark. They're not really quite sure of where there's other related projects, and they're kind of widely spread out across the world. So I think that we're on the cusp of creating a community around this stuff. And I really encourage folks to dip their toe in it. It's a really exciting space. Last question. How can people learn more about Future House or about ongoing projects that you have, how to support, how to get in touch with you guys, what's in the pipeline? Yeah. Any final words about how to engage with you?
Yeah, futurehouse.org. We have our research blog there. We talk about what work we've done. At futurehouse.org, you can get to our platform and use our agents and try out ideas. On the FutureHouse platform, we have a link to the docs, and that is like a cookbook of all of the tools we've made and how to use them, from open source things like PaperQA and Aviary to building your own agents to using our platform as an API for your own work. And yeah, just I'm on X, I'm on LinkedIn. You can DM me. Happy to chat about ideas. And yeah, I think we're pretty open. We try to build a community around Future House, and we're really excited to see what can be built with it. And I think it's great. The physical hubs is great. I think one of the things that's just hard about this is that there's no existing professional communities of AI for science that are really like established, right? I don't know what's the right mailing list or what's the right group to get to talk to. There's no journal for it. So I think it's great to get more community in this space, because there's a lot of super fast, and there's also a lot of siloed information that is hard to get to. So we're doing what we can at Future House to get that out, but I think what you guys are talking about is awesome too.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. And I'm excited to hopefully check in with you again in the future when you published a few mind-boggling papers again. So thank you so much. And thanks everyone for listening. Bye-bye.
Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.